Unit 5, Lesson 3, Pearl Harbor. Our objective is that students will be able to explain the origins of American involvement in World War II with an emphasis on the events that precipitated the attack on Pearl Harbor. Our essential question for the day: how did the attack at Pearl Harbor change America's involvement in World War II? Unit 5, Lesson 3, Vocabulary. Japanese aggression prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1933, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations after criticism for the Manchurian Incident in 1931. In 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out, and Japan essentially controlled the east coast of China until 1945. And number 3, France falls in 1940. The Battle of Britain ends in October of 1940, and Japan occupies French Indochina in September of 1940. Great Britain and the United States react with an embargo on strategic materials of Japan, mainly airplane fuel, scrap metal, oil, and steel. As mentioned, in September 1940, Japan occupied French Indochina, Vietnam. This was an agreement with the French Vichy government, which was under Nazi control. And with it, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact. Japan proved to be a direct threat to British colonies in Southeast Asia. As a result of Japanese aggression, President Roosevelt sends his Lend-Lease supplies to China. President Roosevelt also freezes Japanese assets in the United States and sends General Douglas MacArthur to the Philippines to prepare the Pacific Fleet. You can see from this map the area of Japanese expansion between 1931 and 1940. As we get ready to hear an excerpt from President Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech, I want you to listen and see if you can answer what four freedoms does President Roosevelt mention in his speech given before the United States Congress at the State of the Union, January 6, 1941. Those four freedoms mentioned by President Roosevelt were freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world, freedom of every person to worship God in one's own way everywhere in the world, freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. And lastly, freedom from fear, which, again, translated into world terms, means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. So the U.S. actions, beginning with the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, President Roosevelt could lend or lease goods to anyone whose defense was vital to the United States, anyone like China. The U.S. imposed an embargo on Japan and froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Japan's growing economy blocked from oil imports by this U.S. embargo. Under the leadership of Minister of War Hideki Tajo, Japan's objective was to establish a defensive perimeter in the Western Pacific. Tajo believed that Japan could thus drive out the Western powers, achieve a position of preeminence in East Asia, and free the nation from its dependence on Western oil, coal, rubber, ore, and other vital resources. Tajo's strategy, however, was bringing him ever closer to conflict with those powers. The Dutch controlled the East Indies, France had a presence in Indochina, The United States controlled the Philippines, and Malaya was a British colony. Concerned about Japanese aggression, Holland, Great Britain, and the United States imposed a trade embargo on Japan in July 1941. Cutting off supplies of resources to the increasingly belligerent nation, Tajo, now Prime Minister, was convinced that the West's goal was to starve Japan into submission. In September 1941, United States Secretary of State Hull demanded that Japan withdraw its troops from China and Southeast Asia. While carrying on protracted and deceptive negotiations with the United States, Japan invades Thailand, Malaya, Burma, and the East Indies, and on November 26, the Japanese Navy set sail for Pearl Harbor, where most of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was docked. By the early 20th century, though, Japan's efforts to achieve self-sufficiency were failing, for the nation lacked its own raw materials and other resources. Some members of the ruling class argued that Japan could grow and prosper only by modernizing and adopting Western technology. Japanese nationalists, though, advocated a different path, the establishment of an empire that would not only elevate Japan's stature in the eyes of the world, but also guarantee access to the resources the nation needed. Moreover, many members of the nation's traditional warrior class, the samurai, were embittered by the aftermath of World War I. Japan had backed the victorious Allies, but the samurai believed that in the peace negotiations following the war, the United States and Great Britain had treated Japan as a second-class nation. They too longed to assert Japan's place in world affairs. The attack on Pearl Harbor took place December 7, 1941. The Japanese wanted to buy some time to strengthen their position. America's fleet in Hawaii was a threat to Japan's dominance of the Pacific Islands. Japanese Admiral Ishiroku Yamamoto said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The Japanese reaction to the bombing of Pearl Harbor was that they had won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor, thereby losing the war. An aerial view of the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian island chain. This map depicts a track of the carrier task force for the Pearl Harbor attack, from Japan to Pearl Harbor in the Pacific, and back to Japan after the attack. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese task force, the Striking Force, of 6 aircraft carriers departed northern Japan en route to a position northwest of Hawaii, intending to launch its aircraft to attack Pearl Harbor. In all, 408 aircraft were intended to be used, 360 for the 2 attack waves, 48 on defensive combat air patrol, including 9 fighters from the first wave. This photograph was taken from a Japanese plane during the torpedo attack on ships moored on both sides of Ford's Island after the beginning of the Pearl Harbor attack. The morning of December 7th, 183 torpedo bombers and dive bombers took off from the Japanese fleet, 250 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Japanese attacked in 2 waves. The first wave, or primary attack, and the second waves were seen as the finishers. The first wave was actually detected by U.S. Army radar, but was misidentified as USAAF bombers arriving from the American mainland. Traveling under strict radio silence and screened from view by a large weather front, the Japanese battle fleet, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, remained undetected until it came within 200 miles of the Hawaiian Islands. Battleship Row was the grouping of 8 U.S. battleships in port at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, when the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941. This photo depicts a Japanese torpedo attack on Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor. This is a photo of the USS Arizona burning at Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona burning and sinking. The Arizona was the U.S. battleship that sustained the most damage and had the most casualties during the attack on Pearl Harbor. This photo shows Japanese fighters heading towards a U.S. airfield at Pearl Harbor. The wrecked destroyers USS Downes and USS Cassin in Dry Dock 1 at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. U.S. naval planes and a hangar burning at the Ford Island Naval Air Station's seaplane base during or immediately after the Japanese air raid on Pearl Harbor. The aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese sank or severely damaged 18 ships. Of those 18, 8 were battleships, 3 were light cruisers, and 3 were destroyers. They destroyed 161 American planes and seriously damaged another 102, and left 2,403 Americans dead and nearly 1,200 wounded.